Such, in its veritable theological and metaphysical meaning, is the great, the terrible mystery of the Christian Trinity. But let us lose no time in abandoning these heights to see what is going on upon earth. God the Father, seeing from the height of his eternal splendor that the poor God, the Son, flattened out and astounded by his fall, is so plunged and lost in matter that even having reached human state, he has not yet recovered himself, decides to come to his aid. And that interpretation seems pretty sound upon the limits that seem to be ascribed to Jesus in the Bible. He doesn't speak his own doctrine. He doesn't, so God gives him doctrine. He doesn't know when the hour and all that is going to be, so, saves him a couple times, but, and Jesus is there praying, I don't know if this cup is going to be lifted from me, but, So it sounds, at least from what they're presenting in the Bible, like it's sort of rewriting the narrative, because things didn't go over perfectly. It wasn't some Kabbalistic descent into matter. But the spiritual, at least in terms of divinity, is always present. It doesn't, matter doesn't escape it. So this less spiritual and more spiritual thing that is more popular in the New Age thought, doesn't terribly pan out, does it? From this immense number of particles, at once immortal, divine, and infinitely small, in which God the Son has disseminated himself so thoroughly that he does not know himself. Particularly when we're talking reincarnation doctrines or incarnation doctrines, there's this discovery, hence the term Mashiach. God the Father chooses those most pleasing to him, picks his inspired persons, his prophets, his men of virtuous genius, the great benefactors and legislators of humanity, Zoroaster, Zarathustra, Buddha, Moses, Confucius, Lycurgus, Solon, Socrates, the divine Plato, and above all, Jesus Christ, the complete realization of God the Son. Well, as the metaphor, he was far from the only one. It was in it. Which is the psalm? Is it the second psalm or something that has that Son initiation, the only begotten? Which is, again, something that happens at a particular time in Jesus' life. There's more detail about it outside the Bible, but the Bible makes clear enough to those who are of that bent. At last collected and concentrated in a single human person, all the apostles, St. Peter, St. Paul, St. John before all, Constantine the Great. Well, Constantine the Great saw a symbol in the sky, supposedly, but that doesn't make him one of the inspired or revealed ones, right? He just interpreted some thing that most people would have saw back then. Muhammad, then Charlemagne, Gregory VII, Dante, and according to some, Luther also, Voltaire and Rousseau, Robespierre and Danton, and many other great and holy historical personages, all of whose names it is impossible to recapitulate, but among whom I, as a Russian, beg that St. Nicholas may not be forgotten. Then we have reached at last the manifestation of God upon earth. But immediately God appears. Man is reduced to nothing. It will be said that he is not reduced to nothing, since he is himself a particle of God. Part of me, I admit that a particle of a definite, limited whole, however small it be, is a quantity, a positive greatness, but a particle of the infinitely great compared with it is necessarily infinitely small. Multiply milliards of milliards by milliards of milliards. Their product, compared to the infinitely great, will be infinitely small. The more we know there is, the more we realize there's more for us to know about what is, right? Great, infinitely small is equal to zero. Well, No, the super, super, super small is still something. Um, God is everything. Therefore, man and all the real world with him, the universe, are nothing. You will not escape this conclusion. La ilaha illallah. You know, because nothing has power unless God gives it permission to have that ability or existence or something, right? God appears, man is reduced to nothing. And the greater divinity becomes, the more miserable becomes humanity. That is the history of all religions. That is the effect of all the divine inspirations and legislations. In history, the name of God is the terrible club with which all divinely inspired men, the great virtuous geniuses, have beaten down the liberty, dignity, reason, and prosperity of man. We had first the fall of God. Now we have a fall which interests us more, that of man, caused solely by the apparition of God manifested on earth. See in how profound an error our dear and illustrious idealists find themselves. In talking to us of God, they desire to elevate us, emancipate us, ennoble us, and on the contrary, they crush and degrade us. Well, one of the things about, some of these on that former list don't turn out to be individuals that consider themselves to be inspired or to have received revelation, like what you would call a prophet in pre-modern language, right? But they don't really teach these different religions. It's the professional priesthoods that have attached themselves to their teachings that have poisoned our minds to that. With the name of God, they imagine that they can establish fraternity among men, and on the contrary, they create pride, contempt, they sow discord, hatred, war, they establish slavery. For with God come the different degrees of divine inspiration. Humanity is divided into men, highly inspired, less inspired, uninspired. All are equally insignificant before God, it is true, but compared with each other, some are greater than others, not only in fact, which would be of no consequence, because inequality in fact is lost in the collectivity when it cannot cling to some legal faction or institution, but the divine right of inspiration, which immediately establishes a fixed, constant, petrifying inequality. The highly inspired must be listened to and obeyed by the less inspired, and the less inspired by the uninspired. And thus we have the principle of authority well established, and with it the two fundamental institutions of slavery, church and state. Now there's a difference between religion and church. Church is the hero shrine. And the hero shrine it may lift people up overall, but it kind of cuts people short because it doesn't put people in a position as like, hey, no one's going to do your own hero deeds. Churches tend not to say it that clearly, at the very least. Of all despotisms, that of the doctrinaires or inspired religionists is the worst. They are so jealous of the glory of their God and of the triumph of their idea that they have no heart left for the liberty or dignity or even the sufferings of living men or of real men. Divine zeal, preoccupation with the idea, finally dry up the tenderest souls, the most compassionate hearts, the sources of human love. Now, I was reading from Al-Quran, Surah 385 to 91, and those verses tell you something. And so if you, because people aren't going to understand that. If you say that there's no religion accepted outside of Islam, well, that is not saying the same thing as some people would say by using other terms for religion. Because, only surrendering to God in terms of accepting the truth and the good and acting these things, encouraging these things, only that's accepted. Okay, that comes off differently, right? So then every single individual they're good. Every single path, they're good in truth. That's part of that saying, right? And as far as jealousy, no. When people leave the path, are they going after them for that? No. That is one of the passages in the Quran that makes clear this idea that Muslims are just killing apostates whenever they can. It's ridiculous. It's not based in the religion. The Bible tells them that, and hence this guy, Christianity is considering all that is. I mean, this guy is, Michael Bakunin. Considering all that is, all that happens in the world from the point of view of eternity are of the abstract idea they treat passing matters with disdain. But the whole life of real men, of men of flesh and bone, is composed only of passing matters. They themselves are only passing beings who, once passed, are replaced by others likewise passing, but never to return in person. Alone, permanent, or relatively eternal in men is humanity, which, steadily developing, grows richer and passing from one generation to another. I say relatively eternal because our planet, once destroyed, it cannot fail to perish sooner or later, since everything which has begun must necessarily end. Our planet, once decomposed, to serve, undoubtedly, as an element of some new formation in the system of the universe, which alone is really eternal. Who knows what will become of our whole human development? Nevertheless, the moment of this dissolution being an enormous distance in the future, we may properly consider humanity relatively to the short duration of human life as eternal. But this very fact of progressive humanity is real and living only through its manifestations at definite times, in definite places, in really living men, and not through its general idea. Now, I was reminded, thinking over something that I saw, of this group, and basically it's now we're talking about. You can't point to some glory age. It's like, oh yes, our people were great 50 years ago or 1,000 years ago, and it's like, yeah, then why don't you establish that sort of thing in the modern time, right? The general idea is always an abstraction, and for that very reason, in some sort of a negation of real life. I've stated in the appendix that human thought, and in consequence of this, science, can grasp and name only the general significance of real facts, their relations, their laws, in short, that which is permanent in their continual transformations, but never their material, individual side, palpitating, so to speak, with reality and life, and therefore fugitive and intangible. Science comprehends the thought of the reality, not reality itself. The thought of life, not life. That is its limit. Its only, really, insuperable limit, because it is founded on the very nature of thought, which is the only organ of science. Upon this nature are based the indisputable rights and grand mission of science, but also its vital impotence and even its mischievous action whenever through its official licensed representatives it arrogantly claims the right to govern life. The mission of science is, by observation of the general relations of passing and real facts, to establish the general laws inherent in the development of the phenomena of the physical and social world. It fixes, so to speak, the unchangeable landmarks of humanity's progressive march by indicating the general conditions which it is necessary to rigorously observe and always fatal to ignore or forget. In a word, science is the compass of life, but it is not life. Science is unchangeable, impersonal, general, abstract, insensible, like the laws of which it is but the idea of ideal reproduction. Reflected are mental, that is, cerebral, using this word to remind us that science itself is but a material product of a material organ, the brain. Life is wholly fugitive and temporary, but also wholly palpitating with reality and individuality, sensibility, sufferings, joys, aspirations, needs, and passions. It alone spontaneously creates real things and beings. Science creates nothing. It establishes and recognizes only the creations of life. So, the L, V, and the X are sort of different and separate in those formulas, but, it takes together to explain things, right? And every time that scientific men, emerging from their abstract world, mingle with living creation in the real world, all that they purpose or create is poor, ridiculously abstract, bloodless and lifeless, stillborn like the homunculus created by Wagner, the pedantic disciple of the immortal Dr. Faust. It follows that the only mission of science is to enlighten life, not to govern it. The government of science and of men of science, even be they positivists, disciples of Auguste Comte, are again disciples of the doctrinaire school of the German communism, cannot fail to be impotent, ridiculous, inhuman, cruel, oppressive, exploiting, maleficent. We may say of men of science as such. What I have said of theologians and metaphysicians, they have neither sense nor heart for individual and living beings. We cannot even blame them for this, for it is the natural consequence of their profession. In so far as they are men of science, they have to deal with and can take interest in nothing except generalities that do the laws. And there's a few pages that this could have been longer, but that was lost before publication. They are not exclusively men of science, but are also more or less men of life. And well, I don't know if you could say that science doesn't treat humans like other animals, because we are other animals, right? And if we say that humans aren't animals, the so-called scientists aren't exclusively scientists, right? Everybody has beliefs. Everybody has faith in something. And, a lot of people tend to pretend otherwise, right? Even as a scientist, if it's something observable and verifiable, it's like, do they verify it? It's like, no, it's just, we trust that it's been done. Which is how they trick you nowadays. They say on the news, trust the science, right? Nevertheless, we must not rely too much on this, though we may be well nigh certain that a savant would not dare to treat a man today as he treats a rabbit. It remains always to be feared that the savants, as a body, if not interfered with, may submit living men to scientific experiments, undoubtedly less cruel, but nonetheless disagreeable to their victims. If they cannot perform experiments upon the bodies of individuals, they will ask nothing better than to perform them on the social body, and that is what must be absolutely prevented. Well, social Darwinism was about to take effect, right? The corporations were about to add stuff to the food, which they didn't have to add to the food. It's like, but they, it's cheaper to add some of the stuff to the food, and maybe some of the stuff would keep the food from going bad, so they wouldn't have to throw away some food. And honestly, once you get the people as far sold on that fact, you can run some other experiments with the food, and that's just the food. In their existing organization, monopolizing science and remaining thus outside of social life, the savants form a separate caste. In many respects, analogous to the priesthood, scientific abstraction is their god. Living and real individuals are the victims, and they are the consecrated and licensed sacrificers. Science cannot go outside of the sphere of abstractions. In this respect, it is infinitely inferior to art, which in its turn is peculiarly concerned also with the general types and general situations, but which incarnates them by an artifice of its own in forms which, if they are not living in the sense of real life, nonetheless excite in our imagination the memory, the sentiment of life. Art, in a certain sense, individualizes the types and situations which it conceives by means of the individualities without flesh and bone, and consequently permanent and immortal, which it has the power to create. It recalls to our minds the living, real individualities which appear and disappear under our eyes. Art, then, as it is, were the return of abstraction to life. Science, on the contrary, is the perpetual emulation of life, fugitive, temporary, but real, on the altar of eternal abstractions. Well, not going too far with either side of that. Magic is the art and science of religion. And religion in terms of a relationship, not, just there's rules over you, right? But honestly, relationships regulate, so, it's just a little bit more masculine in its language, to say that it regulates, right? Science is as incapable of grasping the individuality of a man as that of a rabbit, being equally indifferent to both. Not that it is ignorant of the principle of individuality. It conceives it perfectly as a principle, but not as a fact. It knows very well that all the animal species, including the human species, have no real existence outside of an indefinite number of individuals born and dying to make room for new individuals equally fugitive. It knows that in rising from the animal species to the superior species, the principle of individuality becomes more pronounced. The individuals appear freer and more complete. It knows that man, the last and most perfect animal of earth, presents the most complete and most remarkable individuality because of his power to conceive, concrete, personify, as it were, in his social and private existence, the universal law. It knows, finally, when it is not vitiated by theological or metaphysical, political or judicial doctrinarism, or even by a narrow scientific pride. Well, if you're truly scientific, that would also be something that's like, well, I know my limits. Why am I just asserting how much better than I am than everybody else, and somehow it's always going to be that way, right? When it is not deaf to the instincts and spontaneous aspirations of life, it knows, and this is its last word, that respect for man is the supreme law of humanity, and that the real object of history, its only legitimate object, is the humanization and emancipation, the real liberty, the prosperity and happiness of each individual living in society. For if we would not fall back into the liberticidal fiction of the public welfare represented by the state, a fiction always founded on the systematic sacrifice of the people, we must clearly recognize that collective liberty and prosperity exist only so far as they represent the sum of individual liberties and prosperities. And probably more than any other type of movement, the Satanists do this, is they're like, well, it's too fluffy. What's with all this false social justice and all that stuff? And it's like, well, the despairing use of the term social justice warrior, that's ever present and a problem for anybody looking at these people. It's like, you're not really after social justice. This is the new socialism, right? You don't care if it's just or not. They say they do. Maybe they feel they do, but science knows all these things, but it does not and cannot go beyond them. Abstraction being its very nature, it can well enough conceive the principle of real and living individuality, but it can have no dealings with real and living individuals. It concerns itself with individuals in general, but not with Peter or James, not with such or such a one, who, so far as it is concerned, cannot have any existence. Its individuals, I repeat, are only abstractions. Now, history is made not by abstract individuals, but by acting, living, and passing individuals. Abstractions advance only when borne forward by real men, for these beings made not in idea only, but in reality, flesh and blood. Science has no heart. It considers them at most as material for intellectual and social development. What does it care for the particular conditions and chance fate of Peter or James? It would make itself ridiculous. It would abdicate. It would annihilate itself if it wished to concern itself with them otherwise than as examples in support of its eternal theories, and it would be ridiculous to wish it to do so, for its mission lies not there. It cannot grasp the concrete. It can move only in abstractions. Its mission is to busy itself with the situation and the general conditions of the existence and development either of the human species in general, or of such a race, such a people, such a class or category of individuals, the general causes of their prosperity, their decline, and the best general methods of securing the progress in all ways, provided it accomplishes this task broadly and rationally. It will do its whole duty, and it will be really unjust to expect more of it. Now, we really should look at causes. The individual things, sure, maybe that may not be, if it's good or bad for this aspect of life, that may not be the deal deciding whether or not this should be done. But the causes may affect other areas, or regardless of how important the conditions of any particular faction are, tracing out the causes can be a very fruitful thing to do. But it would be equally ridiculous, it would be disastrous to entrust it with a mission which it is incapable of fulfilling, Since its own nature forces it to ignore the existence of Peter and James, it must never be permitted, nor must anybody be permitted in its name, to govern Peter and James, for it were capable of treating them almost as it treats rabbits, or rather, it would continue to ignore them, but its licensed representatives, men not at all abstract, but on the contrary, in very active life, and having very substantial interest, yielding to the pernicious influence which privilege inevitably exercises upon men, would finally fleece other men in the name of science, just as they have been fleeced hitherto by priests, politicians of all shades, and lawyers in the name of God, of the state, of judicial right. Now, there's a difference between it really being in God's cause and the cause of the people as a whole, or what is right, and people saying it is, right? In the name of and in the cause of. That difference. What I preach, then, is, to a certain extent, the revolt of life against science, or rather against the government of science. Not to destroy science, that would be high treason to humanity, but to remand it to its place, so that it can never leave it again. Until now, all human history has been only a perpetual and bloody immolation of millions of poor human beings in honor of some pitiless abstraction. God, country, power of state, national honor, historical rights, judicial rights, political liberty, public welfare, such has been, up to today, the natural, spontaneous, and inevitable movement of human societies. We cannot undo it. We must submit to it so far as the past is concerned. We submit to all natural fatalities. We must believe that that was the only possible way to educate the human race. Well, sometimes if you don't know a different way, you just gotta follow a way, right? For we must not deceive ourselves, even in attributing the larger part to the Machiavellian wiles of the governing classes. We have to recognize that no minority would have been powerful enough to impose all these horrible sacrifices upon the masses if there had not been, in the masses themselves, a dizzy, spontaneous movement which pushed them on to continual self-sacrifice, now to one, now to another of these devouring abstractions, the vampires of history, ever nourished upon human blood. We readily understand that this is very gratifying to the theologians, politicians, and jurists. Priests of these abstractions, they live only by the continual immolation of the people. Now, there's different words for priest, right? Are you an axis-controlling priest, or are you just somebody who's just better knowing in this particular regard and just leaving people in what they do themselves. Nor is it the more surprising that metaphysics, too, should give its consent. Its only mission is to justify and rationalize as far as possible the iniquitous and absurd, but that positive science itself should have shown the same tendencies is a fact, which we must deplore while we establish it. That it has done so is due to two reasons. In the first place, because constituted outside of life, it is represented by a privileged body, and in the second place, because thus far it has posited itself as an absolute and final object of all human development by a judicious criticism, which it can and finally will be enforced to pass upon itself. It would understand, on the contrary, that it is only a means for the realization of a much higher object, that of the complete humanization of the real situation of all the real individuals who are born, who live, and who die on earth. Now, people talk about the ego, and it's like, well, there's the 5 false egos. But the construction of consciousness, you can have a real construction of consciousness. So, the real individual, right? The immense advantage of positive science over theology, metaphysics, politics, and judicial right consists in this, that in place of the false and fatal abstractions set up by these doctrines, it posits true abstractions which express the general nature and logic of things, their general relations, and the general laws of their development. This separates it profoundly from all preceding doctrines, and will assure it forever a great position in society. It will constitute, in a certain sense, society's collective consciousness. But there is one aspect in which it resembles all these doctrines. Its only possible object being abstractions, it is forced by its very nature to ignore real men, outside of whom the truest abstractions have no existence. To remedy this radical defect, positive science will have to proceed by a different method from that followed by the doctrines of the past. Well, we got to be careful about telling the technology to destroy the things that it considers to be flawed, right? The latter have taken advantage of the ignorance of the masses to sacrifice them with delight to their abstractions, which, by the way, are always very lucrative to those who represent them in flesh and bone. Positive science, recognizing its absolute inability to conceive real individuals and interest itself in their lot, must definitely and absolutely renounce all claims to the government of societies. For if it should meddle therein, it would only sacrifice continually the living men whom it ignores to the abstractions which constitute the sole object of its legitimate preoccupations. The true science of history, for instance, does not yet exist. Scarcely do we begin today to catch a glimpse of its extremely complicated conditions. But suppose it were definitely developed, what could it give us? It would exhibit a faithful and rational picture of the natural development of the general conditions, material and ideal, economical, political, and social, religious, philosophical, aesthetic, and scientific, of the societies which have a history. But this universal picture of human civilization, however detailed it might be, would never show anything beyond general and consequently abstract estimates. The milliards of individuals who have furnished the living and suffering materials of this history at once triumphant and dismal, triumphant by its general results, dismal by the immense hecatomb of human victims crushed under its car, those milliards of obscure individuals without whom none of the great abstract results of history would have been obtained, and who bear in mind have never benefited by any of these results, will find no place, not even the slightest, in our annals. They have lived and been sacrificed, crushed for the good of abstract humanity. That is all. Now, the idea of what humanity is, we see that building up, right? Shall we blame the science of history? Well, perhaps the philosophy of the science of history. That would be unjust and ridiculous. Individuals cannot be grasped by thought, by reflection, or even by human speech, which is capable of expressing abstractions only. They cannot be grasped in the present day any more than in the past. Therefore, social science itself, the science of the future, will necessarily continue to ignore them. All that we have a right to demand of it is that it shall point us with faithful and sure hand to the general causes of individual suffering. Among these causes, it will not forget the immolation and subordination, still too frequent, alas, of living individuals to abstract generalities, at the same time showing us the general conditions necessary to the real emancipation of the individuals living in society. That is its mission. Those are its limits, beyond which the action of social science can be only impotent and fatal. Beyond those limits being the doctrinaire and governmental pretensions of its licensed representatives, its priests. And that's a problem too. It's like, at what point are these just purely, they've done deeds that would be independent of the political order, they have beliefs and have said stuff that is independent of the political order, and what of those ranks that they have achieved are from the political order? Because priests, that implies it's a spiritual thing. It's like, but if it's only political, whether you're a priest or not, it is time to have done with all popes and priests. We want them no longer, even if they call themselves social democrats. Well, yeah, nowadays they have put that forward as, talk against, fundamentalists. It's like, well, if people are going straight to the sources and making their own conclusions, see, they don't want you to make your own conclusions. That's why they use that as hate speech. That's why I'm not using those terms like that on this channel, Well, I wouldn't use them regardless of any rules. But once more, the social mission of science is to light the road. Only life delivered from all its governmental and doctrinaire barriers, and given full liberty of action, can create. How solve this antinomy? On the one hand, science is indispensable to the rational organization of society. On the other, being incapable of interesting itself in that which is real and living, it must not interfere with the real or practical organization of society. Again, I would say science is where that is, but, we got to distinguish between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, right? This contradiction can be solved only in one way: by the liquidation of science as a moral being existing outside the life of all and represented by a body of breveted savants. It must spread among the masses. Science, being called upon to henceforth represent society's collective consciousness, must really become the property of everybody, thereby without losing anything of its universal character, of which it can never divest itself without ceasing to be science, and while continuing to concern itself exclusively with general causes, the conditions and fixed relations of individuals and things, it will become one in fact with the immediate and real life of all individuals. That will be a movement analogous to that which said to the Protestants at the beginning of the Reformation that there was no further need of priests for man. Well, how much of the Protestant movement kept to that, right? Who would henceforth be his own priest, every man, thanks to the invisible intervention of the Lord Jesus Christ alone, having at last succeeded in swallowing his good God. But, the transubstantiation of the Mass, right? The drinking and the eating of deity, so-called. But here the question is not of Jesus Christ, nor good God. Because remember, the person's like, good Lord, and Jesus is like, no, I'm not the good Lord. There's only one good Lord, and that's God. So Jesus wasn't it, according to the Bible. As far as talking out the mouth of Jesus. Nor a political liberty, in art of judicial right, things all theologically or metaphysically revealed, and all alike indigestible. The world of scientific abstraction is not revealed, it is inherent in the real world, of which it is only the general or abstract expression and representation. As long as it forms a separate religion, specifically represented by the savants as a body, this ideal world threatens to take the place of a good God to the real world, reserving for its licensed representatives the office of priests. That is the reason why it is necessary to dissolve the special social organization of the savants by general instruction equal for all in all things, in order that the masses, ceasing to be flocks, led and shorn by privileged priests, may take into their own hands the direction of their destinies. Now, in the Islamic world, the person leading the prayer, whether they know more or not, it's not saying that they're better or they're getting more points or whatever. Science is becoming the patrimony of everybody, will wed itself in a certain sense to the immediate and real life of each. It will gain in utility and grace what it loses in pride, ambition, and doctrinaire pedantry. This, however, will not prevent men of genius, better organized for scientific speculation than the majority of their fellows, from devoting themselves exclusively to the cultivation of the sciences and rendering great social services to humanity. Only they will be ambitious, for no other social influence than the natural influence exercised upon its surroundings by every superior intelligence, and for no other reward than the high delight which a noble mind always finds in the satisfaction of a noble passion. And I've looked in quite a bit to the whole Feraferia, Church of Mimic Sciences, Ordo Templi Astartes, and that sort of thing, because as much as they talk about scientific illuminism, romanticism is the key to what they're doing, right? But until the masses shall have reached this degree of instruction, will it be necessary to leave them to the government of scientific men? Certainly not. It would be better for them to dispense with science than to allow themselves to be governed by savants. The first consequence of the government of these men would be to render science inaccessible to the people, and such a government would necessarily be aristocratic, because the existing scientific institutions are essentially aristocratic. Now, English was sort of restructured to prevent poetry. Well, I mean, there's still poetry, but you know what I mean. It's been turned into some rhyming thing and stuff like this, and it was for the most part deeper and more powerful without having to be vulgar. And English set itself as having more words. Things could be spelt the same and sound different and mean different, and they could be spelt differently and sound the same and mean the same. It's, stuff like that. An aristocracy of learning from the practical point of view, the most implacable, and from the social point of view, the most haughty and insulting. Such would be the power established in the name of science. This regime would be capable of paralyzing the life and movement of society. The savants, always presumptuous, ever self-sufficient, and ever impotent, would desire to meddle with everything, and the sources of life would dry up under the breath of their abstractions. Once more, life, not science, creates life. The spontaneous action of the people themselves alone can create liberty. Undoubtedly, it would be a very fortunate thing if science could, from this day forth, illuminate the spontaneous march of the people towards their emancipation. And as that last line of previous paragraph, only they will be ambitious for no other social influence than the natural influence exercised upon its surroundings by every superior intelligence, and for no other reward than the high delight which a noble mind always finds in the satisfaction of a noble passion. So something between karma yoga and jnana yoga. But better, an absence of light, the false and feeble light, kindled only to mislead those who follow it. After all, the people will not lack light. Not in vain have they traversed a long historic career and paid for their errors by centuries of misery. The practical summary of their painful experiences constitutes a sort of traditional science, which, in certain respects, is worth as much as theoretical science. Last of all, a portion of the youth, those of the bourgeoisie students, who feel hatred enough for the falsehood, hypocrisy, injustice, and cowardice of the bourgeoisie to find courage to turn their backs upon it, and passion enough to unreservedly embrace the just and human cause of the proletariat, those will be, as I have already said, fraternal instructors of the people. Thanks to them, there will be no occasion for the government of the savants. If the people should beware of the government of the savants, all the more should they provide against that of the inspired idealists. As it said, science, in becoming the patrimony of everybody, will wed itself in a certain sense to the immediate and real life of each. The more sincere these believers and poets of heaven, the more dangerous they become. The scientific abstraction, I have said, is a rational abstraction, true in its essence, necessary to life, of which it is the theoretical representation, or, if one prefers, the conscious. We got to distinguish between what we're conscious of and how we use the consciousness, and the consciousness itself. It must be absorbed and digested by life. It will gain in utility and grace what it loses in pride, ambition, and doctrinaire pedantry. Stumbling with my words again here. The idealistic extraction, God is a corrosive poison which destroys and decomposes life, falsifies and kills it. The pride of the idealists, not being personal but divine, is invincible and inexorable. It must die, but it will never yield, and while it has a breath left, it will try to subject men to its God, just as the lieutenants of Prussia, these practical idealists of Germany, would like to see the people crushed under the spurred boot of their emperor. The faith is the same, the end but little different, and the result is that of faith is slavery. This, however, will not prevent men of genius, better organized for scientific speculation than the majority of their fellows, from devoting themselves exclusively to the cultivation of the sciences and rendering great service to humanity. We've already gone over that. Because people talk about golden age and silver age and bronze age and iron age and all that sort of stuff. And it's like, well, what about the individual? What age is it for them as an individual? It is, at the same time, the triumph of the ugliest and most brutal materialism. There is no need to demonstrate this in the case of Germany. One would have to be blind to avoid seeing it at the present hour. The 1880s. But I think it is still necessary to demonstrate it in the case of divine idealism. And remember, the 1880s is when Zionism started to be a known thing. You can say it started in the Khazar kingdom, but it wasn't really articulated. It was part of a long plan. Man, like all the rest of nature, is an entirely material being. The mind, the faculty of thinking, of receiving and reflecting upon different external and internal sensations, of remembering them when they have passed, and reproducing them by the imagination, of comparing and distinguishing them, of abstracting determinations common to them, and thus creating general concepts, and finally of forming ideas by grouping and combining concepts according to different methods. Intelligence, in a word, sole creator of our whole ideal world, is a property of the animal body, and especially of the quite material organism of the brain. And we also need to distinguish between, just the body consciousness and what's meant by the mind, right? Because the mind, as a philosophical reference, is not quite the same thing as talking about someone's brain. We know this certainly by the experience of all, which no fact is ever contradicted, and which any man can verify at any moment of his life. In all animals without excepting intelligence, and we see that in the series, in all animals without excepting the whole inferior species, we find a certain degree of intelligence, and we see that in the series of species, animal intelligence develops in proportion as the organization of a species approaches that of man, but that in man alone it attains to that power of abstraction which properly constitutes thought. And the theory of evolution is that everything that exists is equally evolved. And honestly, look at the animals. If the animals are perfect because they don't have the opportunity to make moral failings, are we doing at least as good as that, right? Fine, they won't be uplifted because they could have chose otherwise. So it seems that the mass of humanity is worse than the animals because they could do better, but they don't. Universal experience, on which all science rests, must clearly be distinguished from universal faith, on which the idealists wish to support their beliefs. Because faith is a buildup of belief based on some evidence, some reasoning. And again, you've got to look at that stuff and say, okay, you have faith in this. There's something for you to have faith in because there's something it's based on, but that doesn't mean it's sufficient for all your claims, particularly when people try to have authority over you, right? The first is a real authentication of facts. The second is only a supposition of facts, which nobody has seen, and which consequently are at variance with the experience of everybody. Universal experience, which is the sole origin, the source of all our knowledge, shows us, therefore, that all intelligence is always attached to some animal body, and that the intensity, the power of this animal function, depends upon the relative perfection of the organism. The latter of these results of a universal experience is not applicable only to the different animal species. We establish it likewise in men, whose intellectual and moral power depends so clearly upon the greater or lesser perfection of their organism as a race, as a nation, as a class, and as individuals, that it is not necessary to insist upon this point. Now, we probably should look at that and say, company. Your company is about as important of a decision as you can make for yourself as anything, right? The idealists and all those who believe in the immateriality and immortality of the human soul must be excessively embarrassed by the differences in intelligence existing between races, peoples, and individuals. Not really. But it's important to note that, the tree soul and whatever squirrel or chipmunk or something you may have seen in the background, or if there was a cat or whatever, they have souls too. Unless we suppose that the various divine particles have been irregularly distributed, how is this difference to be explained? Unfortunately, there is a considerable number of men, wholly stupid, foolish even to idiocy. How could they have received in the distribution a particle at once divine and stupid? To escape this embarrassment, the idealist must necessarily suppose that all human souls are equal, but that the prisons in which they find themselves necessarily confined human bodies are unequal, some more capable than others of serving as an organ for the pure intellectuality of soul. According to this, such a one might have very fine organs at his disposition, such another very gross organs, but these are distinctions which idealism has not the power to use without falling into inconsistency and the grossest materialism, for in the presence of absolute immateriality of soul, all bodily differences disappear, all that is corporeal, material, necessarily appearing indifferent, equally and absolutely gross. Well, one of the problems with atheism is that how do you hold anybody accountable if we're just machines, and the so-called mistakes or crimes or whatever that one machine makes versus another machine, either you just terminate the machines and try to develop and call things out till you get a perfection, or you say that you don't have people accountable. You don't hold people accountable because they're not even making decisions. It's just there's no individuals. They're just machines, right? You run into problems very quickly. The abyss which separates soul from body, absolute immateriality from absolute materiality, is infinite. Consequently, all differences, by the way inexplicable and logically impossible, which may exist on the other side of the abyss in matter, should be to the soul null and void, and neither can nor should exercise any influence over it. In a word, the absolutely immaterial cannot be constrained, imprisoned, and much less expressed in any degree whatsoever by the absolutely material. Of all the gross and materialistic, using the word in the sense attached to it by the idealists, imaginations which were engendered by the primitive ignorance and stupidity of men, I think, if anything, primitive as a rule tended to be better than what we have today, but that of an immaterial soul imprisoned in a material body is certainly the grossest, the most stupid, and nothing better proves the omnipotence exercised by ancient prejudices, even over the best minds, than the deplorable sight of men endowed with lofty intelligence, still talking of it in our day. Now, that's one thing that people got. They think, oh, we're advanced and all that. It's like, you mean the same ignorance that was practiced 5,000 years ago? And probably before we could make record of it, just, in different material and psychological, cultural terms, but it's the same ignorance in the following categories. On the other hand, it is certain that no man has ever seen or can see pure mind, detached from all material form, existing separately from any animal body whatsoever. But if no person has seen it, how is it that men have come to believe in its existence? The fact of this belief is certain, if not universal, as all the idealists pretend, at least very general, and as such it is entirely worthy of our closest attention, for a general belief, however foolish it may be, exercises too potent a sway over the destiny of men to warrant us in ignoring it or putting it aside. The explanation of this belief, moreover, is rational enough. The example afforded us by children and young people, and even by many men long past the age of majority, shows us that man may use his mental faculties for a long time before accounting to himself the way in which he uses them, for becoming clearly conscious of it. During this working of the mind, unconscious of itself, during this action of innocent or believing intelligence, man, obsessed by the external world, pushed on by that internal goad called life, and its manifold necessities, creates a quantity of imaginations, concepts, and ideas, necessarily very imperfect at first, and conforming but slightly to the reality of the things and facts which they endeavor to express, not having yet the consciousness of his own intelligent action, not knowing yet that he himself has produced and continues to produce these imaginations, these concepts, these ideas, ignoring their wholly subjective, that is, human origin, he must naturally consider them as objective beings, as real beings, wholly independent of him, existing by themselves and in themselves. Now, whatever age the majority is, that doesn't mean anything. You're innocent until you have accountability and ability to choose otherwise, and that's it. Modern psychologists say that that's at the onset of puberty. And whether that, lines up with the culture or not doesn't matter in that respect, right? 30 is the new 12. It shouldn't be the new 12. You shouldn't expect somebody to have to be over 30 before they finally have the sense of accountability that you'd accept of a young adolescent if this was, the 1800s or something, right? And some people say 21 because you reach a certain extent of your development as a man that you can carry armor and all that stuff. And it's like, yeah, but it's not like you're not accountable for yourself. And if there's actually a defensive war, really, the teenagers should just sit by and watch rather than defend their sisters and their mothers, and some of them will be married young. Of course, the males tended to have to wait to develop skills and savings and stuff like that to get married. The women were like, nature put them in the position. But still, it's not like teenagers should be said, oh, you're not accountable yet. That's only going to make things worse, and that's what we've done in this society. It was thus that primitive peoples, emerging slowly from their animal innocence, created their gods. Having created them, not suspecting that they themselves were the real creators, they worshipped them, considering them as real beings infinitely superior to themselves. They attributed omnipotence to them and recognized themselves as their creatures, their slaves. As fast as human ideas develop, the gods who, as I have already stated, were never anything more than a fantastic ideal, poetical reverberation, or an inverted image, became idealized also. At first, gross fetishes, they gradually became pure spirits, existing outside of the visible world, and at last, in the course of a long historic evolution, are confounded in a single divine being, pure, eternal, absolute spirit, creator and master of the worlds. Well, but still, he's talking about Christianity, so you can enumerate a bunch of limits, right? But what you find, based on the evidence from the different fields, the artifacts, how the brain works, and what we see was probably the case in the differences of the brains between the races and subspecies of modern human and that of earlier subspecies and races among the Homo genus. It turns out that monotheism, beyond limits and stuff like this, is kind of where we started, and a general spiritual presence. And then some ideas developed that were, dynamism, animism, polytheism, monotheistic, stuff like that. But remember, in the 1800s, they thought things developed until finally you ended up with Protestant Christianity, and he's tearing that down and saying, well, is Protestant Christianity really better than the Catholic and the Orthodox? Maybe in some respects, but overall, now wouldn't they be better than the latter? And in every development, just or false, real or imaginary, collective or individual, it is always the first step, the first act that is the most difficult. That step once taken, the rest follows naturally as a necessary consequence. The difficult step in the historical development of this terrible religious insanity, which continues to obsess and crush us, was to posit a divine world as such outside the world, this first act of madness, so natural from the physiological point of view, and consequently necessary in the history of humanity, was not accomplished at a single stroke. I know not how many centuries were needed to develop this belief and make it a governing influence upon the mental customs of men, but once established, it became omnipotent, as each insane notion necessarily becomes when it takes possession of a man's brain. And one of the things we found is that you call the so-called savage philosopher is typified by certain ideas like reincarnation that didn't seem to appear in one generation of humans. It was always something that you could say took multiple generations of thought to develop. Take a madman, whatever the object of his madness, you'll find that obscure and fixed idea which obsesses him seems to him the most natural thing in the world, and that, on the contrary, the real things which contradict this idea seem to him ridiculous and odious follies. Well, religion is a collective insanity the more powerful because it is traditional folly, and because its origin is lost in the most remote antiquity. As a collective insanity, it has penetrated to the very depths of the public and private existence of the peoples. It is incarnate in society. It has become, so to speak, the collective soul and thought. Every man is enveloped in it from his birth. He sucks it in with his mother's milk, absorbs it with all that he touches and that he sees. He is so exclusively fed upon it, so poisoned and penetrated by it in all his being, that latter, however powerful his natural mind, he has to make unheard of efforts to deliver himself from it, and even then never completely succeeds. We have one proof of this in our modern idealists, and another in our doctrinaire materialist. The German communist, they have found no way to shake off the religion of the state. The supernatural world, the divine world, once well established in the imagination of the peoples, the development of the various religious systems has followed its natural and logical course, confirming, moreover, in all things the contemporary development of economical and political relations of which it has been in all ages. In the world of religious fancy, the faithful reproduction and divine consecration, thus, has been the collective and historical insanity which calls itself religion, been developed since fetishism, passing through all the stages from polytheism to Christian monotheism. Now, remember, that's multiple books that I've talked about. That is how they considered the development. And so, Michael Bakunin has this idea that if he tears down Christianity, he tears down it all. But some faiths may not have the problems that he's mentioning. And there's, again, the difference between being dedicated to the divine and the divine dedicating something. The second step in the development of religious beliefs, undoubtedly the most difficult next to the establishment of a separate divine world, was precisely this transition from polytheism to monotheism, from the religious materialism of the pagans. Well, pagan just meant they divided things into work plots, right? You know, on the other side of the vista that we have here, there's you know, what's that over there? It's you know, it's a garden. To the spiritualistic faith of the Christians, the pagan gods, and this was their principal characteristic, were, first of all, exclusively national gods. Well, that's the general thought, right? Is that, oh, when there were hills and stuff in deserts, no, actually in deserts, people tended towards more deities is an idea. Very numerous, they necessarily retained a more or less material character, and by deserts I mean flat deserts, not just, you know, more or less material character, are. Rather, they were so numerous because they were material, diversity being one of the principal attributes of the real world. The pagan gods were not yet strictly the negation of real things. They were only a fantastic exaggeration of them. And again, I don't like to use the word pagan and heathen to denote some type of religion, right? Because remember, the Catholic Church until 1967 said that anybody who was a monotheist was a pagan. I mean, that's not the exact word, but that summarizes it. So if you're a Jewish monotheist, or you were Muslim, or you were a Zoroastrian monotheist, or some Hindu monotheist, you were always classified as a pagan, a heathen, a Gentile. And the biblical words don't really apply in that direction. We have seen how much this transition cost the Jewish people, constituting, so to speak, its entire history. In vain did Moses and the prophets preach the one God. The people always relapsed into their primitive idolatry, into the ancient and comparatively much more natural and convenient faith in many gods, good, more material, more human, and more palpable. Now, people act like, oh, they use the word Yahweh here, and they use the word Al here, and Elohim over here, and Al Shaddai, and different ones. It's like there's the doctrine of Tawheed, the divine qualities. It's the same God. And then when you get to that point, you're taking off some of the limits. Judaism didn't throw away a lot of these labels of, but some types of Judaism did. Jehovah himself, it's always pronounced with a J and a Y and a W instead of a J and a V, because there was no J or V sound in that language. Their sole God, Yahweh, the God of Moses and the prophets, was still an extremely national God, who, to reward and punish his faithful followers, his chosen people, used material arguments, often stupid, always gross and cruel. Now, Buddha, Zarathustra, and most clearly Muhammad pointed out that you got to call the people by that which they know. You can't just have all this new stuff that amazes people and they don't even know what to do with it. You got to call people through what they know, something they can apply right here and now, right? And leave something for the future when they develop themselves, perhaps. It does not even appear that faith itself, to put an end to all religious insanities and the divine mirage, he left nothing lacking but the utterance of those grand words which were said after him, almost at the same time, by two great minds who had never heard of each other, Ludwig Feuerbach, the disciple and demolisher of Hegel in Germany, and Auguste Comte, the founder of positive philosophy in France. These words were as follows. We'll get to that next time.